The first story you'll hear is called Last Stand, and if there is one more story everybody needs to hear at least once, it's this one. It is both horrific and inspiring. The second and final story you'll hear is called Cloak and Dagger. And while there are many crazy stories that came out of World War II, today's story could be not just the single craziest story, but perhaps one of the most influential events that even happened in the entire war. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow button's house, take all their fresh eggs out of the fridge, hard-boil them, and then put them back. Okay, let's get into our first story called Last Stand. On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, during World War I, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlin CK looked out from behind the huge stone walls of Osowice Fortress in Poland. Out in front of him, he saw the same landscape he had been looking at for the last 6 months that he had been stationed at this fortress. It was a big, swampy forest that surrounded them on all sides. Additionally, in this swampy forest around them on all sides were dozens and dozens of trenches. Trenches are long, deep pits that soldiers will dig to both hide inside of when they're being attacked, and then also to launch their own attacks out of from behind their dirt walls. And these trenches that zig and zagged all around Osowice Fortress were created by, and now occupied by, 7,000 German soldiers. And during World War I, the Russians were fighting the Germans. The Germans really wanted to take Osowice Fortress from the Russians. It was in a great strategic position with a railway passing right through it. There was also a river nearby and a main road, meaning whoever owned this fortress was greatly aided in moving critical wartime supplies and troops in a very hotly contested area. But, despite the repeated attempts by these 7,000 Germans to take over Osowice Fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been repelled by Vladimir and the puny 900-man Russian force inside of the fortress. And so, by that morning, August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir is looking out from the battlements over the trenches in the marsh down below, it was like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a sort of stalemate, where neither side was trying to attack the other, and neither side was leaving. They were just kind of staying put and doing nothing. In fact, over the last few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress got so bored. They began sneaking out the side door of the fortress to try to catch fish with their bare hands in the nearby river. But this morning, as Vladimir stood atop the wall, he noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches that was located closest to the fortress. It was still several hundred feet away, but he could see clearly down into this trench. And what he saw was there was this cluster of high-ranking German officers that were kind of huddled together. And they kept looking down at the ground at something inside of the trench that Vladimir couldn't see. And then they would look up at the sky and kind of wave their hands around. And then they looked back down at the ground below them. Now, Vladimir had no idea what they were doing. I mean, again, he could not see what they were looking at in the trench. And when he looked up into the sky where they seemed to be looking, it just looked like a regular blue sky. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was in charge of other soldiers, but because he was so new, he lacked experience and credibility, and so really wasn't considered a serious leader within the army. And so Vladimir, as he's watching the strange behavior, was concerned that if he left now and told his superiors that he was worried about the Germans because they were looking at the sky funny and looking at the sky funny and looking at the sky funny and ground funny, that it would make him look like he was being paranoid and not a good leader. And so, ultimately, Vladimir just looked at this cluster inside of the trench and decided, you know what? They're not shooting at us, there's no attack happening, so whatever they're doing, it can't be that big of a deal. And lately, no one's done anything, so why would that change now? And so, Vladimir left the walls of Osowice Fortress and went down below to hang out with his friends. 3 days later at 4:00 in the morning, the Russian soldiers who were up along the Osowice Fortress walls keeping watch that night noticed something strange out in the darkness near where the Germans were. When they looked out, they saw that the dark night air almost looked kind of blurry or wavy. Kind of like if you were looking at air coming off of hot pavement on a sunny day. It would look kind of blurry. That's what the night sky looked like to them. But of course, it couldn't be because of heat and sun, because it's the morning, it's cold, it's dark outside. And so, as these Russians are looking out, not sure what to make of this blurry area, they began calling up more Russians to go have a look and figure out what this was. And over the next couple of minutes, as the Russians looked out from behind the walls at this air, they realized what it was. It was this huge grayish-green cloud that was as wide as the fortress was, and the wind was blowing it in their direction. Now, the Russian soldiers had no idea what this was, and so they just kind of stood there watching it in stunned silence. And as they watched, they saw as the cloud would touch any vegetation, like leaves on trees or the high grass in the marsh, it would all turn black and shrivel up. And then the soldiers began hearing a soft thump, 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 thump out in the darkness. And it was the sound of birds dying and falling to the ground that were inside of this cloud. At this point, the Russians began to panic, and they began to run to sound the alarm to get the other soldiers up to prepare for an attack. But as they did, they began to smell this very harsh chemical smell coming into the fortress. And then, before long, all the Russians could hear was the sound of their comrades coughing. It would turn out that strange behavior that Vladimir saw 3 days earlier, of the German officers huddled together looking at the sky and then looking down at the ground and then back at the sky again. What they were doing was preparing for a chemical attack on Osoici fortress. On the ground, out of sight of Vladimir, were canisters containing the poisonous gas. And when the officers would look up and put their hands up, they were gauging if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. Now, 3 days ago, the wind had not been in their favor, but this morning at fording 0 on August 6th, 1915, the wind had been in their favor and they had released the gas. And this gas was quite possibly the worst gas you could ever come up against on the battlefield. It was a combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas and bromine gas and bromine gas. On their own, chlorine and bromine are very toxic and can kill you, but when you mix those two gases, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The gas mixture binds to moisture and then turns the moisture into hydrochloric acid, meaning if a person who did not have a gas mask on came in contact with this poisonous gas when they inhaled it, it would literally fill their lungs with acid, which would dissolve them from the inside out. And then also, the gas would get into their eyes and into their nose, and the acid there would burrow holes into their skull. And once you've come in contact with this gas, there's nothing anybody can do to save you. You're gonna die, except it's gonna take a really, really long time. You don't just immediately dissolve. It's this long, drawn-out, excruciatingly painful process. By this point, in World War I, chemical warfare was really not being used by anybody, and so, as a result, the Russian army did not outfit their soldiers with gas masks. The German army did, and they knew the Russian army did not. So, as this horrific poisonous gas began permeating every square inch of Osoici fortress, all of these Russian soldiers had nothing they could do to protect themselves from this gas. And so, right away, soldiers began bleeding from their eyes and their mouths and their ears, and they literally began coughing up chunks of their lung. And so, very quickly, the Russians inside the fortress understood they were being poisoned. And so, these soldiers that were not as affected, at least not right away, by this gas quickly began ripping off their shirts, dunking them in water, and wrapping them around their heads to try to limit how much they breathed in of this chemical. But it really didn't do much to stop the chemical. In fact, these makeshift gas masks might have made it worse because the gas would have bound to the moisture on the shirt. And so the Russians were utterly doomed. They were surrounded on all sides outside the walls by their enemy, and then inside the fortress was this gas, and there was no ventilation in the fortress. And so there was nowhere to go. They couldn't escape death no matter where they went. And so Vladimir, he was one of the guys that was still on his feet inside of the fortress, and he stumbled over to this narrow window on the side of the fortress walls. He looked out and he saw all these Germans running towards them, firing their machine guns. Artillery's being fired. I mean, he knows they are moments away from the Germans breaching the fortress door, coming inside and killing every last one of them. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not being scared or being sad. Instead, he suddenly felt incredibly motivated. If they're going to come in here and kill us, then we're going to make it as hard as humanly possible. First, Vladimir had a reputation for being totally fearless. Over the past 6 months that they had been under siege from the German army out in their trenches, anytime fighting broke out, Vladimir was always the first to run up and be right on the front line of fighting. And then several times when his comrades had been shot or wounded, Vladimir would run out into the line of fire to save the fallen soldiers. It was like Vladimir lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so, as the Germans continued their run towards the fortress, artillery shells are hitting the walls, there's constant gunfire, Vladimir, he leaves his window and he marches back over to the open courtyard inside of this fortress where the 100 or so other still living Russian soldiers were. I mean, they're all gonna die. They've been totally poisoned by this gas, and it's just a matter of time now. But they're still on their feet, and Vladimir walks over to them, and even though again he's pretty junior, he stands up and he says to them, "This is our moment. We are all going to die, but what we do right now will define us." And the way Vladimir said it, he got those 100 soldiers who were on death's door to be so motivated so quickly that they rallied to him. And so, as these men are literally bleeding out of their eyes, their mouths, they're coughing up pieces of their lung, Vladimir explained the plan. And then moments later, with Vladimir in the front, this gaggle of soon-to-die Russian soldiers charged towards the gates, opened the fortress, and began running out towards the Germans, screaming with their bayonets lowered. Now, the Germans on the outside fully expected that this chemical attack would kill all of the Russians. Not taking the Osoici fortress would be super routine because when they walked in, everybody would be dead. And so, suddenly, to have the fortress open and have these men that are covered in bloody rags, and they're puking up pieces of their organs, and they're stumbling forward like zombies with bayonets out screaming like banshees, it scared the living shit out of the Germans. In fact, they were so quickly terrified by what they saw, they literally dropped their guns, turned, and began running back towards their trenches. And as they did, Vladimir and his dead man army began picking off the Germans one by one. And then, after Vladimir and the dead man army ran out of ammunition, they just continued staggering forward directly into the thousands of Germans in front of them, and began picking up dead German weapons and firing them. And then, when they got up to the trenches where these retreating Germans had been so scared they had run into their own barbed wire. And so, there's all these retreating Germans stuck on the barbed wire. The Russians just began bayoneting all these men that were stuck. And so, at some point as Vladimir is doing this, a German soldier ran up to him and bayoneted Vladimir right in the stomach. He ran him all the way through until the barrel of the gun was right up against his stomach. And Vladimir apparently looked down at this bayonet, knew he had been completely run through, and he looked up at the German who had just stabbed him, who was still holding the gun, and Vladimir spit blood and lung tissue all over this German's face and just began screaming directly at this guy. And so the German was so scared he just dropped the gun, turned, tried to run, and then Vladimir was back on his gun with the bayonet still in his stomach, shooting at the Germans. The Germans were so completely caught off guard and terrified by Vladimir's dead man army counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take Osoici fortress. The main reason for that was the Germans who had escaped the counterattack and made it back to their trenches. They told the other German soldiers that the Russians had turned into zombies, literally that they were indeed, and so attacking them was pointless, they're already dead. And the Germans were so scared they refused to leave their trenches again. Once the Russians could tell they had successfully forced a retreat by the German army, Vladimir, who was still alive at this point with a gun still stuck in his gut from the bayonet, he called out to the rest of his soldiers to retreat back to the fortress. And so, this handful of Russian soldiers who were about to die, they hobbled their way back inside of their fortress. And then Vladimir gave his final command, destroy the fortress. If we can't have it, nobody can. every single Russian soldier that came in contact with that poisonous gas died, including Vladimir. When the Germans did eventually take Osoy fortress at a later date when, again, all of the Russians were dead when the Germans went inside, they realized the fortress had been destroyed and it was no longer strategically valuable. Vladimir would be awarded posthumously Russia's highest military honor. His actions and the actions of the other dying soldiers that fought alongside him are remembered today in stories, songs, and statues all across Russia. The next and final story of today's episode is called Cloak and Dagger. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a fisherman named Jose Antonio Reymarie rowed his little boat out into the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of Spain. Jose was a sardine spotter, which meant his job was to go out into the ocean and look down and try to find schools of sardines swimming about 20 feet below the surface, and then he would flag the other fishermen over, who would scoop the fish up with their nets. And Jose was very good at his job. In fact, he was quite possibly the best sardine spotter in the whole village of Punta Umbria, which is a small fishing village in southwestern Spain where Jose was from. But on this particular day, the weather wasn't quite great. The water was kind of murky and choppy, and so Jose wasn't seeing any sardines. But as Jose was starting to feel frustrated, he looked out and on the surface of the water, pretty far away from him, he saw this strange object floating on the surface. And at first, he assumed it had to be, maybe, some dead sea animal that had floated to the surface. But as he stared at it from his boat that was rocking in the water, he saw between waves there was a yellow color on this lump that just looked kind of unnatural. And so, feeling curious about whatever this was, Jose decided to start rowing over in that direction and get a better look. And as he got closer and closer, he realized that yellow color was unnatural. The yellow was part of a life jacket, which meant this was a person floating in the ocean. And so Jose, with his heart now racing, was thinking, oh my gosh, I have to go save this person. And so he raced over right up alongside them. And as soon as he looked down, he realized it was obviously too late. This person was obviously deceased. It was a man who had a military trench coat on, who was lying face down in the water. And so, Jose reached into the water and rolled the guy over, and immediately he was hit with this horrible smell. And then he looked at the face of this dead person, and he was horrified. The guy's eyes were sunken into his skull. He had mold growing on his chin. Bones were exposed, and it almost looked like the dead guy's face was trapped in this kind of ghastly expression, as if the last thing he experienced was horrifying before he died. And then Jose noticed there was something else about this corpse. There was a chain wrapped around his wrist, and that chain extended deep into the water. And so, Jose grabbed the chain and began reeling it back in, and eventually he pulled out this big, black briefcase that had a code on the top of it that you would need to enter in order to open it. Now for context, at this time in Europe, World War I was raging from Britain to Russia. And so there were literally thousands of dead corpses scattered all over the world, basically around the areas where fighting was taking place. So at this time, finding a dead soldier floating out in the middle of the ocean was actually not that uncommon. But in Spain, where Jose was, this was uncommon because Spain had not entered World War I. They were a neutral country. And so, because there was no fighting happening there should not have been any dead soldiers floating just off their coastline. And so, Jose stared transfixed at this dead soldier in his briefcase for a couple more moments. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned and yelled to the other fishermen who were out there in another boat, and tried to flag them over to help get this corpse out of the water. But the other fishermen, when they realized what Jose was asking them to do, they said, no, we're not helping you with that. We're not touching the dead body. And so Jose just grabbed the dead body with one arm and then, awkwardly with his other arm, he managed to row this boat and drag along this corpse all the way back to the beach. And as he did, he and the other fishermen were kind of yelling back and forth at each other. It was kind of a commotion on the water. And so, by the time Jose had got the corpse back to shore and dragged it up onto the sand, villagers in Punta Umbria had heard the commotion and come outside to see what was going on. And they saw Jose standing there with this dead body. And so, they began forming a crowd around the body. And so nearby, Spanish soldiers were doing a training exercise, and they saw this crowd gathering on the beach. And so a group of them walked over to see what was going on, and they pushed through the crowd, and they saw this dead body on the ground. And right away, they began searching the dead body to figure out who it was. And when the Spanish soldiers found his identification papers, they learned that his name was William Martin, and he was a major in the British Royal Marines. Also on these papers, it said that Major Martin was assigned to the Combined Operation Headquarters in London, which the Spanish soldiers knew was an outpost that organized commando raids on Nazi-held territory. Under Major Martin's military trench coat, when the soldiers opened it up, they saw he was dressed in full kit, full battle gear, which suggested he had died during one of these commando raids. But after the Spanish soldiers had removed his gear, they couldn't find any shrapnel wounds or gunshot wounds, and so the running theory was, he must have been flying over this area and maybe his plane was shot down, and that's why we can't figure out how he died. But the Spanish soldiers had not heard any reports of a plane being shot down right off the coast, and so really, they had no idea how Major Martin actually came to be here. Then, one of the Spanish soldiers, who was still searching Major Martin's pockets, found in one of them some crumpled papers and a photograph. And after he looked at them, he tapped on his commanding officer's shoulder and showed them. The photo was black and white, and it was this pretty young woman, and on the back of it, it was signed Pam. As for the crumpled papers that had been near this photo, they were bills. One was from a London nightclub from 3 nights earlier, and the other was a receipt for a diamond engagement ring. Now, these Spanish soldiers were not overly emotional, but they couldn't help but think how kind of sad it was that, Major Martin obviously was in love with this woman, Pam, and they must have just gotten engaged, and now he's dead. It's like a tragic love story. And so, the soldier who had found these bills in this photo folded them back up and tucked them back inside of Major Martin's pockets. And then the soldiers talked about what they should do next. Now, technically, because Spain was a neutral country, what they were supposed to do was turn this body back over to the British because he was a British soldier. But the Spanish government was run by a fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, who was not really neutral at all. He was actually secretly aligned with the Nazis. In fact, the Nazis' leader, Adolf Hitler, had helped Franco come to power, and so now that he was in power, he regularly shared secrets with the Germans. And so, when these Spanish soldiers eventually contacted their higher-ups to ask what to do with this dead British soldier, their superiors told them, "Do not give Major Martin's body back to the British. Instead, bring his body to a nearby morgue where agents who worked for Franco would be able to inspect the body and open up that briefcase and see what was inside." And so these Spanish soldiers did as they were told. And when Franco's agents were able to finally pop open that black briefcase that was connected to Major Martin's wrist, they discovered inside 3 letters from leaders of the British military. And when Franco's agents read these letters, they knew right away they had discovered something incredible. And within days, these letters were sitting right on Adolf Hitler's desk. Now at this time in April of 1943, Hitler was starting to worry that he was about to lose the war. Even though the Nazis had successfully conquered most of Europe, it felt like the tide was turning against them, and in Hitler's mind, it was starting to seem likely that the Americans and the British were poised to launch some sort of massive attack on Nazi-controlled territory. And if they weren't ready for it, this could cost them the war. But Hitler had no idea where this major light attack was going to happen, and so trying to figure that out was basically the biggest priority the Nazis had at the time. Now, most of Hitler's intelligence suggested that this big, major light attack was going to take place on Sicily, which is an Italian island. Italy was allied with the Nazis, and Nazi spies who were monitoring British and American phone conversations were hearing lots of chatter about an invasion of Sicily. And so that's why they believed that's got to be the place, that's where the attack's going to happen. But when Hitler looked at these 3 letters that were found inside of Major Martin's briefcase, everything changed. The letters, which were all signed by top leaders of the British military, said that the plans to attack Sicily were actually fake, that British and American forces were talking on these obviously tapped phone lines. They knew the Nazis were listening about this invasion of Sicily just to confuse the Nazis. They wanted the Nazis to think that Sicily is the place. But, as these letters would go on to explain, the real place, the real location of this huge Allied attack, was going to be Nazi-controlled Greece. So, 500 miles away. And so as Hitler is reading this, he's terrified because in his mind, he always thought Greece was really the Nazis' weakest link. And so, to get this intelligence, it was the equivalent of like winning the lottery. Suddenly, Hitler went from having no idea where this huge attack on him was going to be to knowing exactly where it was going to be, and knowing that he would have the time to shore up his weakest link, Greece. And so on May 12th, 1943, less than 2 weeks after Jose, the sardine spotter found Major Martin's body floating off the coast of Punta Umbria, Hitler sent a military directive to all of his leaders to prepare for a huge Allied attack, not on Sicily, but on Greece. And before long, German tanks were rumbling from southern France to Greece, and tens of thousands of German soldiers were setting up barriers on Greek beaches to repel the invasion. And then out at sea, the famous German U-boats, their submarines, which were so deadly during World War I, were out all over the place getting ready to shoot any Allied ships that came towards the shore. In short, the Nazis were ready. But by July 9th, so 2 months later, nothing had happened. There had been no major Allied attack on Greece, on Sicily, or anywhere else for that matter. Meanwhile, back in Sicily on July 9th, one of the few soldiers who was still stationed there, because remember, all those soldiers had been pushed to Greece, one of the few remaining soldiers was in his bunk writing a letter to his mother, and he would detail that it just felt quiet in Sicily. And after he had written this letter, signed it and put it away, he heard outside a massive booming sound. And so he ran outside and he looked in horror towards the horizon. Now, instead of being a beautiful clear blue, it was black with smoke and warships as far as the eye could see. He couldn't even count the number of warships on the horizon, and they were all coming right towards Sicily, firing their cannons and guns. This was the big Allied attack. It was on Sicily. The few soldiers in Sicily who came out of their bunkers and looked out and saw this knew right away that they were so ridiculously outnumbered that there was absolutely no hope. And so the soldier who had just written to his mother about how calm it seemed here, along with several others who were standing near him, they immediately just took off their uniforms and ran. And soon, the other soldiers on the island began coming out of their cover, and seeing they were under attack, most of them did the same thing. Everybody basically ran away. And so the British and the Americans that were coming on warships barely had to fight. They took over Sicily incredibly easily, and within a few weeks, the Allies had complete control over the island and the Italian government had been overthrown. Hitler had thought the secret intelligence he had found inside of Major Martin's briefcase would help him win the war, but in reality, those letters actually proved to be the beginning of the end for the Nazis. It would turn out Major William Martin, the dead British soldier that Jose the sardine spotter found off the coast of Punta Umbria, Spain, was not really who he appeared to be. In reality, Major William Martin didn't exist. The body definitely existed, that was a real dead body, but the identification of the body was fake. It had been fabricated by the very smart British intelligence officers named Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley as part of their very famous operation called Operation Mincemeat. And this operation was truly one of a kind. It was designed entirely to trick Hitler. The Allies knew if they dropped a dead British soldier off the coast of Spain, a neutral country, that they would turn it over to the Germans, and that's exactly what happened. And so everything that was on the fake Major's body, from the trench coat to the kit he was wearing, to the identification papers, the receipts, the photos, all of it was placed very intentionally to convince the Germans that Major Martin was real. Major Martin was given a high enough military rank that it kind of made sense that he might be carrying this really special briefcase with highly classified military secrets, but his rank was not high enough that he would be known in military circles, because that would make it too easy for the Germans to identify that this was fake. And for the same reason, Montagu and Cholmondeley gave their fake major a very common name, Bill Martin name. There were loads of Martins in the British military at the time, making a fake one hard to spot. But the British intelligence officers knew that they couldn't just present this kind of basic, generic British soldier and trick the entire German military. They needed to give him a backstory. And so Cholmondeley and Montague spent as much time on Major Martin's uniform and what he was wearing as they did on his fake love affair with Pam. Montague and Cholmondeley had a woman on their staff write these phony love letters to Major Martin, pretending to be Pam. And she wrote in beautiful curling penmanship talking about how difficult it was to be in love with him during a war. And then also, Cholmondeley and Montague got that receipt for the diamond engagement ring, along with the nightclub receipt from just a couple of days earlier. And they tucked it into his pocket, really making it feel like this tragic love story. And so it was a combination of all of these details that had been thought through so carefully by these intelligence officers that really made Major Martin seem 100% real. As for the real identification of the dead body, it belonged to a 34-year-old homeless man from London named Glinder Michael. Michael had lived this wretched, miserable life, and then eventually died when he ate trap poison that was on a piece of bread. We don't know if he tried to kill himself or if it was accidental. Michael's body had been stored in a refrigerator in a morgue unclaimed for months. When Montague and Cholmondeley found out about him and decided he would be perfect because no one would notice if his body went missing. And so, ultimately, Operation Mincemeat was a massive success. Hitler completely mistook a homeless man from London for a relatively high-ranking British military officer carrying international secrets on his wrist, and it cost Hitler the war. Glinder Michael may have lived a wretched life and died in absolute agony, but in death, he helped defeat the Nazis. Today, there is a marker on Glinder Michael's grave in Spain that actually denotes him as an official British military officer. As for Montague and Cholmondeley, they were quickly promoted after Operation Mincemeat and then ultimately became famous for their plot. On July 4th, 2018, a paramedic was hurrying through a hospital in England when a supervisor flagged him down, looking very concerned. She asked him if he had been one of the paramedics on a very specific call a few days earlier. Surprised, the paramedic said yes. The call had been completely typical, so he didn't really understand why this particular call mattered so much, but the instant he confirmed he had been there, his supervisor said she would explain in a minute, but for right now, he had to take off all of his gear, like all of it right now, because there was a chance that what he was wearing could kill him. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right show because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow button's house and remove all of their outlets and replace them with blank plates. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 29th, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend, Charlie Roly. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. They had been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years, and so she had a hard time finding work. For the last 2 years, she had actually lived in a therapeutic group home, but it was a little after she had moved in there that she had, very fortunately, met Charlie. Now on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin, he also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so, when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just gonna pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy, and so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated, and she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned to get together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie, Unn really was excited for her life with him at the current moment. As they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So, before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs. And being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family, and now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad. Not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that, Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with their family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so, in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10:00 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room listening to Charlie and their friend, Sam Hobson, talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she had gone to her place and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left of the dye that was left. And then she had called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults, but her own mother. So Dawn's mother had custody of the youngest child, and Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at the get-together, and her mother had said yes. So Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street, or even in dumpsters, and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around, so the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. 10 minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:00 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank it on the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and he sat on the couch next to her and said, "Good morning." And between Dawn not feeling that great physically, remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen. And then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts. But they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money, and so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. Then she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this, and she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrist, and she rubbed them together, and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom. And then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so, she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now. And so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend, Sam, to shoot up some more heroin because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so, at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door. And as soon as he opened it, he gasped because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor. And he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover, this is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that, Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic, but they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited. And so, they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn. So he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived, and by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio, and sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was gonna be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing: Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher. And then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could then. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that. Because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down, you know? This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean. And this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent in being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now they were back at his place to pack up a bag, both for himself and also for Dawn, that they would bring to her at the hospital. And then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room, and he just sits down on the couch feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs because I always do drugs and this is not it. I've never felt this way. He looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if some poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened, or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me. Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was gonna attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth. And then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up. And then, the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend, Sam, grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room, while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever, he had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. And the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so, the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user. And the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine. And Charlie was also still unconscious and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs, It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she had taken some prescription psychiatric medication. And so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs, so he was waiting on those results. But, admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment, because some of the symptoms you get with a gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together the morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so, presumably, they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment and then he feels sick. It just, it didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to the strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England. So Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they had issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and everybody else involved with the case, because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so for days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it, but now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter. The next day, at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so, they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better. And she was doing better. She didn't want much, she just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life. And that's the path she was on. And so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not, but as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful, but he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. I mean, none of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so, at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs. But they did show something else, something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones risk here. Everyone was. Like, literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital, literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger, and it might already be too late. And so, Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office, he picked up the phone, and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits. and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the Yokai Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie, and others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was a document, this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so, at this point, all Murphy or anybody else for that matter could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic. But specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened, and now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one, and that was Charlie's apartment. And so, Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment, made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor, and open bags of fabric, and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters, and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair-dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response, and other areas of the place were littered with medical debris like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick maybe from an overdose. But soon it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results. It was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper that was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it, belonged in the space was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted, and Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning.